Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Jones. I'm the Associate Director of Education at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and I'm thrilled to greet you all and welcome you to Conversations in Black Freedom Studies, virtual edition. Thanks for joining us. And thank you to Lorraine Herman for live captioning tonight's event for the hearing impaired. We will paste instructions for viewing those captions in the chat window now. The Schomburg Center, a world-renowned institution dedicated to archiving, studying, and interpreting the global Black experience, is celebrating its 95th year. And we have a lot of virtual and digital offerings in store, such as our Black Liberation reading list, events like this one, and much more, all of which you can explore by visiting schomburgcenter.org. It's always great to have the Conversations in Black Freedom Studies series as a monthly space to talk about new works in Black social movement history. But I'm feeling even more grateful for this space this week, for this opportunity to be together and think about our collective past and our collective future together. Tonight, we consider the relationship between the Black struggle and other struggles in this country. Tonight, we have an opportunity to step back from the news and the headlines and think about histories of multiracial struggle and solidarity. To guide us in this, we are so fortunate to have three amazing authors talking about their books and their ideas, help us gain a greater perspective. So in a moment, we'll introduce Paul Ortiz, author of An African American and Latinx History of the United States, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, author of An Indigenous People's History of the United States, and Johanna Fernandez, author of The Young Lords, A Radical History. If you haven't already, you can purchase all three of these books at the Schomburg Shop, schomburgshop.com, while supplies last. Now, virtual events are not the same as gathering in person, but they do create some new opportunities for engagement. For example, when we get to the last portion of our program tonight, if you want to ask a question of our speakers, you can click on the Q&A menu item, which for most of you will be near the bottom of your Zoom window, and just type your question into the box that pops up. We're also streaming live to YouTube, and we'll take questions there too. This event is being recorded and will be available for anyone to view after the fact on the Schomburg Center's live stream and YouTube pages. By default, all of you watching will remain anonymous in that recording. If we read out your question, we will only mention your first name to preserve your anonymity. Now, this is an important discussion, and I'm quite certain we won't get to every question, but we'll do our best. Feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and we'll get to them again in the last part of tonight's agenda. And now I'd like to bring on stage my co-moderator, Brooklyn College professor of political science, Jean Theo-Harris. Welcome, Jean.
Thank you, Brian. It is great to be here. It's great to be at the Schomburg Center virtually. It's exciting to be in this new kind of online season of Conversations in Black Freedom Studies. Kamosi Woodard and I started this series 8 years ago, partly because there were fewer and fewer spaces for us to gather and hear new work in Black history, and really to kind of use this history to think about where we are today, right? Because I think at base, this series has always been about the histories we need to see the present more clearly. And certainly tonight, that's very much what we're going to be doing. As usual, Conversations in Black Freedom Studies takes place at 6:30 Eastern Standard Time on the first Thursday of the month. And so we will be back next on December 3rd, and we'll be talking about kind of criminal justice and resisting the kind of carceral city. And Garrett Felber, Carl Sudler, and Kelly Lytle Hernandez will be with us again on December 3rd. So please join us. And then we'll be back again in February for the spring season. But tonight, as Brian was saying, we're going to be looking at multiracial struggles and multiracial solidarities. And we are so lucky to have Paul Ortiz, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, and Johanna Fernandez with us to help us, again, see this history that we need for the present. First, Paul Ortiz is the director of the award-winning Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and a professor of history at the University of Florida. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz is a historian, author, and speaker who researches Western Hemisphere history and international human rights. And Johanna Fernandez is an assistant professor of history at Baruch College of the City University of New York. So CUNY's in the house today. So thank you all for joining us and for being with us. And I guess where I'd like to start, instead of having formal presentations for people who are longtime visitors to our series, right? Usually we have formal presentations when we're actually at the Schomburg Center, but on Zoom, we've found conversation works better. So I think where I want to start us tonight is just a little bit about how you come to the research and the books we're going to be talking about tonight. What was your journey there intellectually, politically, personally, to the research you're going to be talking to us about tonight? Johanna, why don't you start us off?
You know, that's a question that keeps on changing. I'm still trying to figure it out. But this was my dissertation project many, many moons ago. And, you know, I'm in the academy, but not of it. So I did 1,000,001 things before I finished the book. And I was determined to write a history that lived up to the fierceness of the young lords. I feel that because this history is untold and because it's so fierce, I became obsessed about discovering everything about the organization. And I wrote a completely different book, like to the dissertation. No two words are alike. It's a new book. And I'm from the Bronx. I discovered the Young Lords when I was senior, probably at Brown. And I was shocked that no one knew that who the hell knew that this fierce group of incredible Puerto Ricans had taken over a hospital, among other things. So I think that inspired my journey, which was a long one. And I wrote the first dissertation on the Young Lords, but I was also writing about the Young Lords when you heard about the Young Lords, people said, who? Now they're all that and a bag of chips. And I think they are in part because the Young Lords themselves challenged me to not discreetly do the research for my book, but to help amplify the story of the Young Lords in the public square. So I directed a series of very popular exhibits here in New York City. And I also sued the NYPD for the surveillance records of the Young Lords, which are part of the Handshoe files. And I sued them because I was pissed off. I had been in a conversation with the NYPD for 10 years, and I decided, well, I'm from New York. Let me just roll up at One Police Plaza. And they were like, oh yes, Professor Fernandez, we know about this request and we've been at it for a minute. You're going to be very happy about the conclusion of this request, of Freedom of Information Law request. And a number of calls later, and like 5 months later, they sent me a letter that said that they were going to dismiss my case on a technicality. And I was just pissed off because they were very solicitous and duplicitous. And I literally borrowed money from TIAA-CREF, hired a lawyer and sued them. And 2 years later, it's a very Byzantine process we went through. I lost, but I went to New York 1, and I'm going to end in a minute. We went to New York 1. Dean Meminger, who's from the Bronx, the reporter, the scraggly reporter from the Bronx, was now the big man at New York One. He heard the story and he was like, oh, the NYPD top dogs are having a press conference right now. I'm gonna go find out about these papers. And he went. Like, I didn't think he was gonna go. I literally left to the Dominican Republic. I was on my way to the Dominican Republic. He went, and then when I get to the Dominican Republic, my phone is ringing off the hook. And people have seen this on New York One. He asks the police top dogs about the hand shoe files. And they get all defensive because this is in the middle of Black Lives, the beginning of Black Lives. And 2 weeks later, their people call my people and they call me in to identify the hand shoe files, over 1 million surveillance records of the NYPD, of New Yorkers, including those of Malcolm X. So it's a little bit about my journey.
Thank you. And just to correct something, a mistake I made, Johanna is an associate professor at Baruch. And like so many things at CUNY, the web is not trustworthy. So I'm sorry about that. And also I just wanted to say, one of the things we're going to be talking about tonight is the kind of revelation of all of this multiracial organizing that we didn't know. And I was just teaching my class today on women in the Black freedom struggle, and the kind of revelation of the Young Lords is always for my students that moment of like, wait, people actually are organizing together. Wait, the Young Lords is actually, 25% not Puerto Rican, and just this, like that all these histories are taking place in these really complicated ways that show us again the way forward. So Paul, how about you? How did you come to this research? How did you come to this book?
Well, not really through academia, because I've never been encouraged in academia to do any kind of, really intersectional, radical kind of history. As we all know, we're dissuaded from speaking truth to power, even to this day in higher education. But I really came through the work learning to be a movement historian, which I didn't know I was doing at the time. I was a younger labor organizer with the United Farm Workers of Washington State. And we were in the middle of an 8-year struggle to unionize the vineyards at Chateau Saint Michel in Eastern Washington. And I want to thank everyone on the call tonight, because I know there's some people here who are actually instrumental in supporting that boycott. What was interesting, as I started with UFW in the late 80s, I was born in 1964, so I wasn't around during the Great Boycott and some of the earlier iconic struggles, but I really began to learn the history of the union. And I was put on the spot because I was one of the organizers who, was college educated, and people asked me, well, okay, how do we win the Great Boycott? What happened back in the day? And this is when I really began to learn about amazing organizers and this incredible history of struggle that I was a part of. And I began to learn about people like Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, and Dolores Huerta, and these multi-generationals of intersectional Black and brown and Asian and white working class and African-American organizers who had been trying to organize agriculture for hundreds of years, literally from the 1500s onward. So it was really through my movement experiences, also very personal experiences. I grew up in the 1970s. We know that as the backlash era. It was an era of tremendous racism. Affirmative action was under siege the way it is now, right? We just had the failure in California, which is very important to reflect on in terms of the referendum. But when I was growing up, I was called a spick, a wetback. There was this constant sense of being under siege. And I didn't really realize until I was in high school that, the problem wasn't me. And I was so glad when you started us off by asking us to talk about our personal experiences, because we're often, especially as people of color, we often hide our experiences. There's a lot of trauma, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of anguish. But I had an amazing white school teacher my senior year, Don Bidwell. He had me read a book by Richard Wright called Native Son. And this opened my eyes, and it taught me in a very concrete way for the first time that racism wasn't my fault, it wasn't my problem, that systemic racism is the problem of this entire society. Connected to that, years later, when I became a college professor, I guess the thing that really animated me to write and African American and Latinx history of the United States was really my students. You know, so many of my students when I taught at UC Santa Cruz were first generation Chicano, Mexican American, white working class students. And now that I'm at University of Florida, so many of my students are first generation Haitian American, Cuban American, Venezuelan, so on and so forth. I do a lot of teachers workshops in South Florida. And when I talk to the students down there and the teachers, they say, you know, our experiences, Professor Ortiz, are not reflected in your textbooks. You know, let's break down some simple concepts. Isolationism, this idea that we teach generations of US history students. My Haitian American students would say, when has the US ever been isolationist? You all have been interfering in our politics even before we gained independence in 1804. My Cuban American students would say, when has the US ever been inwards looking? You've always owned a huge part of our nation, our island. And so our students would ask me, or my students would ask me, where are we in these textbooks? Why are our parents and grandparents invisible? And so, I mean, for all these reasons, I decided to write the book the way I wrote it. The last thing I'll say is I grew up in a white nationalist society. It's still white nationalist. And the challenge to me as a historian is, if we want to break this cycle of white nationalism, let's stop teaching white nationalism. Let's shake up the textbooks. Let's do what Johanna and Roxanne have been doing so successfully. Because when I was a kid, and this is going to sound a little weird for me to say this, but you know, they would dress up us kids of color. They would put wigs on us. They'd powder our faces, and we had to recite lines by Alexander Hamilton or George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. These were people who despised us. They didn't want us to have citizenship. They didn't want women to have equal rights. None of those people did. And so my fear is we're still asking people to dance and pantomime and recite Hamilton and Washington and Jefferson. Let's think of some other individuals and especially social movements to understand where change comes from, how we arrived at this moment, not through the founding fathers, but through the struggles of our ancestors.
Thank you. And I think you remind us how, you know, our journeys to our sort of work are often through activism, through organizing, and especially through our students. Roxanne, how did you tell us about your journey to this book?
Well, thanks, Jean, and thanks to the Schomburg Library, which I much admire, and to Brian and Jean and my co-panelists. Well, I come from rural Oklahoma, Southern Baptist, evangelical. And fortunately, I came of age when the civil rights movement was happening, even in Oklahoma. It was the first sit-in was in Oklahoma in 1955. And I had left the rural community where I grew up, Canadian County, Oklahoma, to go to trade school. My last year of high school, I worked full-time and went to high school. So I was downtown, my school was, and I saw these young Black women, so courageous. They weren't that much older than me. I was 17, they were like 18, 19, 20. And I said, that's who I want to be. That's what I want to be. But it wasn't that easy in Oklahoma to be active. It's a very oppressive place, an oil, it's almost like Saudi Arabia. It was called the Saudi Arabia of North America when I was growing up. And very impoverished Native American tribes, 50 because they were forced to go there from everywhere else. And then the native tribes of the plains, all of them horribly impoverished, Black communities that were very strong because they were former Civil War soldiers who came there, but they were autonomous. And of course, everyone knows about the Tulsa race riot, the White Riot, that destruction, which we didn't learn about in Oklahoma textbooks by any means or anything else. So that was, you know, I was like a blank slate in a way. The first thing I shed was my Southern Baptist religion, and went from that to being an atheist permanently. And somehow something about me was a magnet for mentors. I had so many radical mentors in Oklahoma, one being a Palestinian who was only 10 years, he was 21 years old and 10 years from the time of the Nakba. And the first thing I learned about internationally was Palestine. And that made me understand colonialism. And then he said, look around you at the native people here. This is just like the Palestinian situation. Well, I had never thought of that, but these things were put in my mind. Then I got married and to a very liberal union family, trade union family, and learned, you know, a lot about labor movements. And my father-in-law had integrated the Carpenters Union in Oklahoma. And so there were always Black unionists around, you know, around that I got to meet, and people in struggle. So then I went to San Francisco, 1960, and San Francisco State was not what it became. It was a pretty white place at the time. It's very multicultural now. But it was very active. People were, in 1961, going down to the bus rides and involved in the civil rights movement. And of course, I was married and kind of limited in my activity. I actually wanted to get a degree so I could work in an office and get a slightly higher pay because I would have a college degree. That was my only real aspiration, going to college. But in the process, I started learning. I took a history class, world history, and read a book on imperialism by P.T. Moon. I still had that book, and it was just amazing. I knew Palestine, but I didn't know the extent of US imperialism. And so this put me on the path of history. I fell in love with history. And then, of course, when I got in graduate school in history at UCLA, I found the parameters of what you could, well, my first seminar, they were talking about manifest destiny. And I had never heard that term, actually. And the professor started explaining it. And I said, oh, you mean imperialism? And he said, are you a Marxist? And I said, I think I'll go look at Marx. So then I really started studying Marx. And so anyway, all of that was, for me, history was activism from the very beginning, of trying to untangle the United States history. So I took a lot of Latin American study courses because that's the only way you could study imperialism. It was, imperialism in Latin America. They actually taught it in the Latin American studies. There was also African studies at UCLA, and there were African National Congress exiles, Black and white, there that I got involved with the anti-apartheid movement in 1965, 66. So this, you know, like Paul said, my book didn't really come from academia, because I got involved with the American Indian movement. And I really kind of got drafted into the American Indian movement because Wounded Knee had happened. And I was finishing my dissertation, and also I was in law school. So people from the Wounded Knee Legal Defense were kind of trolling the law schools for students to help out. And I got trolled and pretty well recruited to work on the trials after Wounded Knee. So this is what brought me into the American Indian movement. And there I learned the real history of the United States. The imperialism that happened started there with the continental imperialism, and then moved overseas, but it was from day one. And I learned this from Native people who didn't even have an 8th grade education. They knew these things. So it was in this context that I decided, instead of teaching in history or trying to get a job in history, I would get involved in ethnic studies, building ethnic studies and Native studies. So I took a job in Native American studies in a very incipient program. It was just a program, and helped build it into a department of ethnic studies, which is still very successful at university. And this then, you know, I was really privileged because I was able to design my own curriculum. The entire 35 years of my university life, I designed every course that I taught. I don't think many people get to do that, but I did. And so I started publishing very quickly. I published my dissertation, The Roots of Resistance, A History of Land Tenure in New Mexico. And it was a Marxist historical materialism dissertation on colonialism and 3 levels of colonialism: Spanish, and then Mexico, and then the United States. And then I never would have thought of writing an Indigenous people's history of the United States, but Beacon Press actually invited me to do that in 2007. And with this revisioning history that Paul's book is also published in that series. And I said, oh, that will be easy. Well, 8 years later, 7 years later, the book came out. It was a very, very difficult book to write because it's an Indigenous people's history of the United States. So it is a history of the United States. It's not a history of Native people. It's a history of the United States from the perspective that I learned myself. So it's very much it's a dynamic book, and I think that's why it's become so popular. I never expected it to, you know, most what I publish is very minimal, you know, distribution. It takes off over time, gets used in classes, 12 different books, but this one is a whole new experience. Every day I receive 4 to 5 invitations. It used to be to travel somewhere, now on Zoom. And it's now also in a young adult version. So that's really my journey with this book. And it's really, to me, a great privilege that I was able to do it.
Thank you. So this is the part of the conversation where we want you to teach us something. And in particular, when I think about my education, even through college, I you never learned about kind of moments of multiracial organizing, moments of multiracial solidarity that, finally in college, I started to get to learn some African-American history, some Latino history, but it was really not till grad school that I got to sort of learn moments where people had been organizing together. And so what I wanted to each of you to maybe tell us a story of a kind of moment of multiracial solidarity or organizing that people don't know, that I think helps us kind of think about this history anew. And maybe Paula, you could start us off.
Wow. It's such oh my gosh, there's so many examples of, multiracial solidarity and organizing. I want to preface this by saying, again, in the academy, we're always taught about conflict between peoples. We're always taught about, it's almost like it's like we deify social Darwinism, and this idea we're always at each other's throats. And, there's moments of that as well, but I found so many moments of solidarity and organizing and mutual aid when I was writing in African American and Latinx history in the United States. I start, chapter 1 really begins in the American Revolutionary period. But the title of chapter 1 is The Haitian Revolution and the Birth of Emancipatory Internationalism. Chapter 2 is the Mexican War of Independence and US history, anti-imperialism as a way of life. Now, and this kind of brings me up to the example, Gene, that I want to share with you. When I started writing the book, like Roxanne, and Roxanne may not remember this, but the conversations that I had with her and that I learned from her about the process she went through in writing Indigenous people's history of the US were so critical to me and so inspiring and so instructive, because I had a lot of people say, Paul, when is that book coming out? Why is it taking you so long to write? And I remember talking to Roxanne about her kind of authorial struggles, because on the one hand, there's really no model for us to write the way we write. And trying to really shake up these categories in American history to decenter white nationalism, to place African-American freedom struggles in Latin America and the Caribbean at the center of US history was really challenging. It was really difficult, and especially writing for a general audience. And I'm so grateful for Beacon Press because I had such amazing editors who were so patient with me and took time with me. I'm so grateful for my wife, Sheila Payne, my comrade in struggle, because I had these great editors who like checked me and lovingly nurtured me to tell these stories in a very clear manner. So the moment that I want to share with folks is one of the most incredible moments that I know of as a historian. And I originally had a chapter in the book titled 1820s to 1920s, the golden age of anti-imperialism in the Americas. And I still want to write a book like that, because that time period, that century between the 1820s and 1920s, when you look at radical Black abolitionism, it's an internationalist movement. You look at the struggles for independence in Latin America and how they're connected to the Haitian Revolution and the North American struggle and what's happening in the Pacific and the Atlantic. And so many scholars have really educated us about this. But the moment I want us to kind of zero in on is 1928. We're in Los Angeles. It is the NAACP National Convention, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. You may not see the NAACP as radical, but I have a message for you that in the 1920s, the NAACP is very radical. It's being pushed to the left by the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the largest mass organization of African Americans in history. And in 1928, W.E.B. Du Bois is asked to write a speech about why should Black people risk their lives to regain the right to vote. Because if you ask a Black person to try to register to vote anywhere in the South, and frankly, in a lot of places in the North in 1928, you were asking them to risk their lives. And so what W.E.B. Du Bois comes up with is, he talks about economics, he talks about politics, he talks about, family and things like that, but he goes directly to anti-imperialism. And I want to read a brief passage from Dr. Du Bois that he made at the convention in 1928. he said that the American ballot must be reestablished on a real basis of intelligence and character. Only in such way can this nation face the tremendous problems before it, the problem of free speech and unsubsidized press and civil liberty for all people, the problem of imperialism and the emancipation of Haiti, Nicaragua, Cuba, the Philippines, Hawaii, from the government of American banks, the overshadowing problem of peace among the nations, and of decent and intelligent cooperation in the real advancement of the natives of Africa and Asia, together with freedom for China, India, and Egypt. It's a sweeping freedom vision. It's really intersectional. It's the culmination of a century of radical Black and brown ideology, organizing, and what I call radical international emancipatory internationalism. It's not something that Dr. Du Bois creates out of thin air. It's based upon really centuries of struggle and this idea that, yes, Black people need to fight to regain the right to vote for economic uplift, for political advancement, but we have a broader responsibility because our nation is fundamentally imperialist and it's fundamentally oppressive and it's fundamentally corrupt. And I would argue we're really at the same place we were in 1928. And this is why the political struggle is so very important. So that's the moment that came to mind, Gene, when you're asking that question. It's about voting, it's about politics, and it's about where we still are today.
Thank you. Johanna, how about a story of multiracial organizing?
Okay, so there are 1,000,001 Young Lord stories. I'll repeat what you said, Gene, which is that the Young Lords was one of the most diverse, ethnically diverse organizations of the period. Approximately 25% of the organization was composed of Black Americans, another 5 to 7% non-Puerto Rican Latinx folks, and then Puerto Ricans. And then the Young Lords formed part of the Rainbow Coalition initiated by Fred Hampton in Chicago, which brought together Black Americans in the Black Panther Party, Puerto Ricans and Mexicans in the Young Lords in Chicago, and poor whites from Appalachia. And the objective was to come together on the basis of a shared class interest. So the Young Lords, for those of you who might not know, are the Puerto Rican counterpart of the Black Panther Party. I think it's important to note that they are self-proclaimed revolutionary nationalists and socialists, and they emerge in 1969 at the height of a moment of radicalization throughout the world. So there's a poll in 1969, probably a better poll than the ones that we see today, that determined that 2 million American students believed in the importance of building a revolutionary party. So the Young Lords come into the struggle with an analysis of oppression that's structural. And part of what they understand is that the economic organization of society is pivotal for understanding how society works and its various oppressions, that how society organizes its goods and services is central and is connected to racism and sexism and homophobia and heteronormativity. So that's important. They're self-proclaimed socialist. And I want to read a quote because the moment that I want to talk about is when they occupy Lincoln Hospital. They do the unthinkable and they occupy Lincoln Hospital, which had already been a site of struggle, but they kick it up a notch. And I think that what we can learn about the Young Lords is that they developed a strategy and they kept at it through militancy and coalition building until they got what they wanted. It wasn't a one-time thing. They first started, they decided that they were going to go to the emergency room, which was infamously known for being a horror show. And they were going to work with workers at Lincoln Hospital to have a complaint table for patients and workers. And over the course of 3 months, they collected 2,000 grievances, which they then took to the administration. And for background, this is a moment when the budget cuts and neoliberalism is beginning to grip American society in the late 60s, because there's a crisis that is brought about by the Vietnam War, overspending in the Vietnam War, and the war on poverty. So they are at this hospital. It's one of the poorest, most health compromised districts in the country, the highest heroin addiction. The Bronx is an industrial, like decaying industrial strip of land. The industrialization has already hit the Bronx. And part of what the Young Lords are arguing, and others, is that in fact, what the environment looks like and economic and social issues have an impact on health. And we're here because you are planning to cut the emergency room, which is the 4th busiest emergency room in the country. And you're planning to essentially cut staff, doctors in an already busy hospital that doesn't have enough beds or staff. So they take these complaints to the administration. The administration does nothing. But what the Young Lords do, along with other hospital workers, is that they take grievances to their hand, in their hands. They literally go to the different floors and the different departments where patients and workers are having problems, and they act as advocates, health advocates. So this notion of health advocates emerges in this period. They're also realizing that there are all kinds of people who don't speak English. So we need translation. And so they're doing this work in the hospital. Finally, because there's no movement forward, but also because July is the moment when the budget of the city is going to be determined, and Lincoln is scheduled for the largest budget cuts. They occupy the building, and they literally, 150 of them, they get into a U-Haul and a number of cars, and they head to Lincoln Hospital at 5 o'clock in the morning. They literally invade the hospital with white coats, and they lock all of the doors and windows so that the cops won't get them. And they have a press conference planned for 10 o'clock. And their purpose is to dramatize the horrific conditions of health under which poor Black and Puerto Rican people are being treated at the butcher shop of the Bronx. And they're working with white workers, not white workers, white medical workers, doctors, and they're having to address patriarchy, the white supremacy, a sense of elitism and middle-class respectability among the white workers. But they understand that everyone in the hospital, regardless of race and class, want the same thing. And so they figure out ways of resolving conflict through political education. So literally they get the doctors to read Frantz Fanon, because the doctors think that the Young Lords are too uppity and that they shouldn't take a lead from the Young Lords. And I think what's important is that they released the hospital. However, not before the mayor sends his people to talk to the Young Lords about releasing the hospital and the problems in the hospital. So this gets an enormous amount of media attention, and it shifts the terms of debate in the city around the fact that medical empires like Columbia University, Einstein Medical Hospital have pretty much taken over the medical industry and turned it into a for-profit venture. This is a new development in medicine and the health industry. Okay, long story long, Then a woman by the name of Carmen Rodriguez dies only 2 weeks after they've taken over the hospital. And this is a problem, but the community has already been mobilized, and they pressure the hospital and its medical corps to agree to having a conference, a medical, clinical, pathological conference in which they discuss with the community the circumstances that led to the death of Carmen Rodriguez. This is cited as the first and only such medical conference in the history of medicine, wherein people in the community are allowed to cross-examine doctors on what they did wrong. Carmen Rodriguez was a Puerto Rican woman. She was the first woman to die of an abortion. She got a botched abortion because a medical intern failed to check her record. Why? And it failed to talk to her because we're seeing a paternalistic medical system that infantilizes people of color. So part of what they're talking about is medical discrimination, a situation in which doctors don't even refer to you by name when they see you. And this is one of the things that the young lords with the doctors came up with, that in fact, how are we going to do this, white doctors? And how are you going to produce medical care with dignity for people that you think are children of a lesser God? Why don't we start by calling them by their last names, greeting them upon arrival and asking them what's wrong? And why don't we help patients become partners in their medical care? So why not tell them exactly what's wrong with them and what you think should happen, and give them the option of saying no, because I don't think this is good for me. So in this process, what emerges as workers in the hospital who are not doctors, but these are the people who are the least paid, super exploited workers, the people who clean the hospital, the laundresses, everyone and their mother, poorly paid, with doctors and the young lords and people of the community. Through this very local struggle, they draft the first known patient Bill of Rights, something that we take for granted today, which establishes that care should be afforded with dignity, especially to people of color, that medical discrimination is a real thing. They ask for medicine, free medicine, and healthcare for all, that healthcare is a human right, and a series of other demands that I don't, here they go. To have access to your medical chart. This is a pretty basic thing that wasn't a thing because the medical field is this very elitist, unreconstructed, uncivilized venue in American society. To know what medicine is being prescribed and what it is for and what side effects it will cause. To choose the doctor you want to have and to have the same doctor treat you all the time. So something known as the continuity clinic is a product of the struggle at Lincoln. If you go to hospitals, public hospitals, still today, you will be seen by a revolving door of doctors who are on call. And part of what they said is that poor people who are going to public hospitals because they can't afford anything else deserve dignity and to be treated like human beings. They also, of course, wanted to build a healthcare system organized around preventative care. So they argued that there should be doctor calls to people's homes, and that every neighborhood in the Bronx should have a clinic, and that in the example established by Cuba, that there should be a team of doctors and specialists and social workers and mental health folks who go door to door and help the process of preventing disease before it hits us. Part of what they accomplished was that they expanded our experience and notion of freedom in the area of health. But they also, and this is something that we need to learn from today, part of what they forced the medical industry and New Yorkers and white Americans in New York to understand is that the hospital and the moment when you are sick is the moment when you are most human, and the moment when we need to show a reverence for life. And that really is a litmus test for the democracy of our society. And I'll just end by saying that I think that the reason why there were these explosions was in part because we saw a healthcare system that lost its reverence for mortality at the height of the pandemic, when the state failed so many Americans. And that is the moment when our humanity is calling on us to reorganize how we do business, how we take care of each other when we're most human.
Thank you. Roxanne, how about a story from your work in terms of a moment of multiracial solidarity or organizing that we don't know?
Well, I thought of three. It's a kind of arc of my experience with Wounded Knee. This was really the first time that, the American Indian movement was also a part of the Rainbow Coalition in Chicago, but they were very newly formed at that time. And at Alcatraz, that went on for 18 months, a long time. At first, there were a lot of visitors, but really not that multicultural, more just Chicanos and white people. But then Wounded Knee was something really different for the first time for Native Americans, having visitors over a period of 6 weeks. The occupation of Wounded Knee was in February, March of 1973. In the dead of winter in South Dakota, in the Pine Ridge Reservation, at the place where the Army massacre of the refugees, the Lakota refugees, were trying to turn themselves in. They were starving. The Army was surrounding them, and they were massacred. More than 300 women, children, and elderly men. And of course, the Sitting Bull was also assassinated at that time by them. So it is this very wounded place, Wounded Knee. And that, it was just amazing, the people who came at first before the Army surrounded it and sealed the parameters. People still got through, Native people did, bringing food and all, because they knew their way around, but they couldn't really have visitors after the first 3 weeks or so. But in those first 3 weeks, Angela Davis came. She was kind of, this was right before she went on trial, but she was world famous. People from the Stokely Carmichael came, many Mexican leaders. Dolores Huerta was there. My friend Betita Martinez was given a shotgun, which she had never had before, and told to guard the perimeter. So there were wonderful stories of in horrible conditions, and very dangerous, that people were very courageous and came and learned a great deal. And then I take that then to to the Standing Rock in 2016, when right during that time when Trump was elected. It was the most extraordinary thing. Again, a South Dakota, North Dakota winter, just really harsh conditions. The protest against the pipeline had been going on. They had had a community there, Native community, since April, but it wasn't until October that the news of it got around, and very suddenly huge numbers of people started coming, and organizations. Black Lives Matter, which was only really a year old at that time, people set up different tents and teepees. And for the first time, all the Native leaders of every Native nation in the United States came with their flags. It was the diplomatic area, but also United Nations representatives came. One of the most impressive things was to see the veterans organization, the anti-war veterans, led and organized by Wesley Clark Jr., who's the son of Wesley Clark, the head of NATO, the US general. And he put out a call for, because they were being attacked by not only local sheriffs, but federal armed people, and then mercenaries. Blackwater the federal government was sending mercenaries, and it was a very tense situation. So he asked the call, and 10,000 people signed up and headed there. He had to stop. He said, it was already, the dead of winter. So it was a very multinational group of veterans, many of them recently in Iraq and Afghanistan, some going back to the Vietnam War or Grenada or Panama invasion, the Gulf War. And they had a ceremony with Leonard Crodog, who's a spiritual man there, of asking for forgiveness for what the Army had done. It really makes me almost cry. It was just such a inspiring moment for everyone who was there. One time there were 50,000 people there. It was really extraordinary. I think historically nothing like it's ever happened. And everyone who was there, and there were many children that were brought there, school children from Chicago, who stayed there the whole time. I think their lives are impacted forever from that experience.
Thank you for sharing that story, Roxanne. That's really powerful. We are starting to get some questions in the chat, and I just want to remind people that we are moving close to questions from the audience time, so please do type those in, and also you can type in questions in YouTube as well, and we'll get to them. We are running short on the time where Gina and I get to ask questions, so let me try to squeeze in at least one here. And I guess I want to ask you to bring your analysis and your historical perspectives forward to our present moment. And this is a week of weeks, and where a lot of people there's a lot of talking heads on television trying to make an analysis that has to do with racism and white supremacy and all of these kinds of things. But given your research and the way you step back and look at the history of this country, what are you thinking about this week? How do your stories and your research help us see this week in American politics? Johanna, why don't we start with you?
So many different things. Where does one start? Very close election. I will maybe read this quote. I lost the quote, so maybe I won't read the quote. But Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz work, in fact, inspires me. That's one of the questions. Because she helps us understand the depth of white supremacy in this country in her book, Loaded. It's a history of the Second Amendment. And part of what we see is that white supremacy has deeper roots than we understand. And when we talk about racism in this country, there's the tendency to talk about Black people and people of color, but in fact, racism and white supremacy are white problems, historically rooted in settler colonialism, and slavery and capitalism. So I want to read a quote that I think is revelatory in this period. And before I say that, I'll say that it's impossible to deploy war as we have over the last 30 years with mercenary armies, 40 years in Panama, in Guatemala, and in Central America during Nicaragua. It's impossible to eviscerate like the seat of civilization, Iraq, as we did, and do all of the horrors that we did abroad and not have that come back and bite us in the butt. So here it is. But I want to read from Erich Fromm. I've been reading Escape from Freedom. Although I don't think this quote is from Escape from Freedom, which actually says that, you know, we human beings are not very well suited emotionally. We've not gone very far emotionally, and that is a barrier to our freedom and reorganizing society. And that in fact, we fear freedom because it's different. So, you know, reorganizing society, which is what we need, is scary. Erich Fromm says, a society that lacks the means to provide adequately for the majority of its members, or a large proportion of them, must provide these members with a narcissistic satisfaction of the malignant type if it wants to prevent dissatisfaction among them. So we have a situation in which inequality and class inequality is epic. And absent an explanation of the horror show that is American society, and people suffering and joblessness, the society has to give people a sense of superiority, at least a segment of them. These are the psychological wages of whiteness that W.E.B. Du Bois talks about. And so I think that the answer has to be one of two things. Either we separate, we get a divorce, right? Or we figure out a way to solve this problem, because a lot of people are suffering. Black people, people of color are suffering disproportionately. We are the victims of terror, police terror on the part of the state. But everyone is in a bad situation, or a significant number of people. And I think that this is really a moment for political education. Like, I don't know how the hell we're going to do it, but we need political education campaigns to civilize a society that has been made stupid by white supremacy, literally, and the control of the schools and the media and the ideological state apparatuses by the ruling class.
Thank you. Roxanne, what are you thinking about this week?
Well, I'd like to give a quote too, and then I talk about what I'm thinking about. This is from David Scott, who's at Columbia University, a Trinidadian, Afro-Trinidadian. Only a deliberate practice of collective remembering can make meaningful change possible. I think it's actually a book he did on Grenada being invaded, and how people have not been able to deal with the trauma and the mourning there. And I think that's what we have here is we need to go into a state of mourning, basically, in this country, to put to rest the entire official narrative of this country, and just look truth in the face, and go, we can't go anywhere until we do that. And even the left does not do that. The analysis is always some version of the original narrative. And it really has to be deconstructed completely. So I've been obsessed in the last, since quarantine started. I actually settled down to write another book for Beacon that I had a contract for 3 years. And I just finished it last week. So it's literally been 8 hours a day, 6 days a week that I've worked on this book. And it's called Not a Nation of Immigrants. The nation of immigrants idea. White supremacy, settler colonialism, and a history of erasure and exclusion. And it's very painful researching and writing that history, especially the Yellow Peril chapter, the Chinese, because this continues today, making Chinese Asians evil. And it started in the Middle Ages, and it has never let up. We now have, Wuhan flu and this kind of persecution. I live in a city that is half Chinese, San Francisco, and you would think there would be a lot of power with half the population. Not that much, and a lot of persecution. So on and on, but the whole process of immigrants having to become settlers, of reach for whiteness. And James Baldwin deals with this so brilliantly, of anti-Blackness having to be a prerequisite for being accepted as an immigrant. And simply find just the process, seeing these people go through, these persecuted Jewish people from Eastern Europe, Italians who were starving in southern Italy, coming on the boats, the Irish refugees from famine, a million of them. What happens to the Irish? They become the police forces and the police unions. So there's this destruction of whole peoples coming to this country by Americanizing them. And it's a tragic story. It was much more than I expected to. It was supposed to be 60,000 words, and it's 120,000 words, it turns out. There was just no way to deal with it. So that has put me in a whole new way of thinking of immigration. I started off being mainly concerned with the border, of course, and the caged children. And went back into that whole history of the war against Mexico, the establishment of that border, that it's not really a legitimate border even, and the continued persecution of Mexicans and Central Americans. And that's an ongoing thing, but that was my main interest. And I expanded it, that it's not just, the Mexican people. So that's really where my thinking has been, just having finished last week.
Wow. Congratulations. Thanks for sharing that. That sounds like something we need to be having you back to talk about. Paul, what have you been thinking about this week? How has your history or research or perspectives helped you understand where we're at today?
Brian, in Florida this week, we are commemorating and mourning the 100th anniversary of the Ocoee Election Day massacre, when hundreds of African Americans in Western Orange County who tried to vote in the 1920 election were massacred, were driven out of their homes, were murdered, were raped, were lynched, driven out so that white real estate interests could take over their land and their property. This is the 100th anniversary. And the intersection with voter suppression, the long Black freedom struggle, the struggle that we waged statewide just 3 years ago to gain 1 million petition signatures to help restore the rights of convicted felons, this is all kind of coming together in a dramatic way in this election. Just yesterday, I zoomed in to do a workshop, anti-racist workshop with people in Elaine, Arkansas. Last summer, the oral history program at the University of Florida, we went out to help the people of Elaine and Phillips County commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Elaine massacre, where federal troops and white organized individuals came and laid siege to that community, killed hundreds of African Americans. And so I agree with what Roxanne is saying. Roxanne mentioned also the Tulsa massacre in 1921. And these begin to add up. And we need to get away from this idea of American exceptionalism, this idea of the US as the most democratic nation on the earth, this idea of the US has ever really been a democracy. Because for people like us, it has not been. For the victims of the Ocoee massacre or the Elaine massacre or Longview or Chicago 1919, East St. Louis 1917, the anti-Chinese pogroms, the anti-Mexican pogroms and lynching, this has never been a democracy. It's never even been a middle-class society. One of the things I learned from Dr. King in reading his last work, Chaos or Community, was he said, stop calling the US a middle-class society. It's never been that way. When you call it a middle-class society, you make everyone who isn't middle class dysfunctional. Enslaved African Americans weren't middle class. Mexican farm workers weren't middle class. The custodian who cleans your building today is not middle class. And so stop using that ridiculous language. And as scholars, we have to become activists. We live in a time of crisis. It's global crisis. And I think being in Florida has really put this in my face in many ways. But working with people in Ocoee and Elaine over the years has been inspirational as well. The best discussion I've ever been involved in that involved slavery reparations happened in a room in Elaine, Arkansas, 2 summers ago. Elaine has a population of 775 people. And it was an amazing discussion about why reparations are needed now. Because so much this country has stolen so much. And the wealth of this country, it's so important for us to understand, left, right, whatever the case may be, the wealth of this country rests not upon the hard work of the citizenry. It rests upon the exploitation, the theft of land from indigenous people, the continuing exploitation of people in Haiti, in Mexico, in the global South. And so let's liberate ourselves by working for the liberation of others. But we've got to shake up these myths. And this is why I'm so proud of and honored to be in this amazing panel with Roxanne and Johanna, who are shaking things up, shaking up the narrative. Let's just continue doing it.
Fabulous. Thank you. Okay, our time is, of course, running out and the questions are piling up. I'm going to try to bring some of them together into kind of one mega question. Let me read them out and see, maybe you can take pieces of this. The one is from Carter. Can you share with us each of your thoughts in consideration of the caste system, CASTE, of the separation of the masses here in the US of A, maybe in reference to the new, as Isabel Wilkerson book, Caste, as a framing way of thinking about racism in the United States. There's another question about from a librarian. Megan, I'm a library and information science graduate student concentrating in archives and digital preservation. The literature I've read has taken the stance that the work of archivists and historians is fundamentally neutral, especially when it comes to social justice and struggles. I disagree, do you? And I think also maybe bringing these together is the Schomburg Center itself is a place for collecting and telling stories and writing new narratives about Black history. And I guess it raises for me a question about how do you see the place of Black history and the Black struggle in this broader tapestry that you're describing? So I know that's a lot, but Roxanne, take whatever part of that you like.
Well, I have a problem with using the terminology of a very specific system, the caste system of Hindu caste system, because I think it really, even though I did that at one time myself, I actually wrote an essay called Caste and Class, and had when I was a graduate student. I disagree with it now because I think it does not get to the uniqueness of US white supremacy. I think it's unique in the world. And I think this waters it down. Well, that's one thing. As for the Black liberation struggle, this has been the heart of our movements. Someone told me once, I think it was Jack Odell, he says, if you look at history, every single successful change or struggles really started with a Black struggle, starting with the insurrection and slave rebellions, which certainly did happen all over the United States all the time. The marooning with the Seminoles in Florida and the Great Dismal Swamp in North Carolina. And I kept that in mind, and really I think that is the case. If it were not for, yes, Native people have always resisted, but they had no, basically as being foreignized, as simply their land and the whole continent taken and then incarcerating them. They had very little support from the outside, and to his great shame, I think he historically, Frederick Douglass was so racist against the Native people. So it's this is the problem, that once there is a Black and Native and alliance with that pre-US period building up, this will be the moment we have a revolutionary theory to work with. And until then, I think we're in these separate channels, not putting things together in a way that will make us understand how we might have a future and how we might present that and educate people about it, and for it not to be, they're so intertwined. If they're separated, the bodies of the Black bodies that were sold, that were the main collateral by 1840 on the stock market in New York, and the real estate, the land, the body of the Native people, those are inseparable because they removed the Native people in order to have slavery in the Southeast.
Thank you. Paul, what do you want to respond to?
Well, the second half of the question about archives and libraries, of course, archives, just to reflect the questioner, archives are never neutral. I think that the Black Lives Matter movement is helping us to build a new kind of archive, a new kind of library, a new kind of curriculum in motion. The Black Lives Matter democracy movement has created these incredible new spaces. I often joke with people that what we used to call Hispanic Heritage Month is usually my second busiest month of the year behind Black History Month in terms of lectures and workshops. This year it was incredible, it was off the charts, because the Black Lives Matter movement has opened this new space for us to interrogate our histories. We can't let this moment pass, brothers and sisters. And I'll tell you, one of the exciting things to see as a historian is that the energy is coming from high school students. Everywhere I go, I see high school students, I see teachers, I see parents demanding a new kind of revolutionary, or at least small d, democratic history, right? And it's all over the country. And it reminds me of the Chicano blowouts. So I always taught, I've always taught that in Chicano Latino history. And one of my dear mentors, Carlos Munoz, who helped found ethnic studies at Berkeley, was part of that, right? In high school in Los Angeles. And then that cohort brought that spirit and passion for revolutionary history into the colleges. And then we get ethnic studies, right? I think the same thing's happening now. I think that high school students all across this country are demanding a new kind of history, and they're engaged, and they're walking out in solidarity with each other. I remember last year I spent time with Watsonville High School students, 98% of them Chicano, in Central Coast of California, right? And at the end of our session, they said, hey, don't tell the adults here, but we're planning to walk out in solidarity with the high school students in Florida who just suffered the terrible shooting. And so all these moments of solidarity are really percolating from the grassroots. In Florida, we have the Dream Defenders. We have all these really great, passionate organizations of struggle, and we are creating new curriculum. But again, the moment is now. It's never been a more important time to be an archivist, a librarian. Let's just move this movement forward.
Fabulous. Thank you. Johanna. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Okay, so part of what I read when I learned when I read this book by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, Loaded, was that the early state, the early colonial state, deputized white Euro migrants to North America. Literally subsidized gun ownership because it needed the European population to help stave off a rebellious Native American resistance to colonial rule and the displacement of Native Americans from their lands. White Americans are also deputized to put down slave rebellions, which is why when we think about gun ownership and the Second Amendment, we don't think about the natives. We can't think about the natives. So that gives a sense of the white supremacy that was defining and is part of the DNA of this country. But on the issue of Black struggle and Black people and the history of slavery, I teach Reconstruction for like 4 weeks in my 20th century history class, because I think Reconstruction is foundational to understanding even where we are today. 4 million slaves produced the wealthiest society that humanity had seen, second only to the British Empire. 4 million slaves in the southern United States. So that means that the struggle, and by the way, at the beginning of the Civil War, the 4 million slaves were worth more than all of the industrial investments and capital of the entire country combined. I think the statistic is that the 4 million slaves were worth, I think, 3 billion, and everything else was worth 2.5 billion. in terms of goods and services and profits in society. So that was going to be a battle of epic proportion. The Civil War happens, slavery is ended, but that society doesn't produce a different society to replace the economic system known as slavery. Not only that, it invites the old planter class, the slavocracy, to rebuild that society. It's insane. Did the American Revolution invite the British to remake American society? So part of what we have in the South is an unending counter-revolution. All counter-revolutions are vicious and deploy terror. That's the moment when the KKK emerges. And if we are serious as scholars, we will say that part of what emerges in the South after Reconstruction, which was a moment of possibility that had to be eviscerated, was fascism. Like, think about the fascist character of this. And the reason why we've not said it is because of anti-communism. Because to criticize America too much is to be called a crazy communist. And so anti-communism in this country has in fact circumscribed our understanding of society because of fear. So in many ways, Trump, I think, is a consolidation of that counter-revolution. And I'll just end here. I just read Tara Hunter's incredible book on the laundresses in the South. So the women launderers who were Black, this is after, immediately after the Civil War during Reconstruction. Though the freedmen, that's what the escaped slaves were called, not the freed slaves were called. So the laundresses, the Black laundresses, they say to the old planter class, under which they're still working, oh no, we don't want to work in your house because we already been through slavery. We want to work in our house and we want to reorganize production. Think about that. The Reconstruction era produced one of the most radical aspirations for reorganizing society. And that was led by the freedmen and Black women who were like, no, we want to reorganize production. We want to do it in our homes so that we can collectivize it. That has to be killed. That has to be killed. That is one of the most radical proposals in American history, literally changing production and how it happens. And on top of that, you have to have a fascistic system that keeps Black labor in its place and that recruits poor whites to make Black oppression and lynchings a festival of poor white folks at the bottom of society, right? The same deputization of white people that happened previously is happening under these circumstances. And this is the history that I don't think even historians have come to terms with, let alone the rest of the population. It's a history that definitely merits reinvestigation. And it's about speaking truth to power with courage as historians, as writers, as organic intellectuals, without fear of retribution. Because right now, I mean, this is the consequences. We're living with the consequences of not speaking up and writing the boldest, most unrepentant history of the terror that has been American history.
Wow. Well, with this awkward 90 seconds of time left, I think we might have to just leave it there. And thank you so much for the perspective that you gave us. And I just want to encourage everybody again to pick up your books, to dig into these histories, an African-American and Latinx history of the United States, an Indigenous people's history of the United States, and the Young Lords, a radical history. All three are available from their publishers and also right now at the Schomburg shop at schomburgshop.com. I want to thank you three. That was amazing. So much to think about. Thank you, Jean Theo-Harris, co-founder of this series, and for co-moderating tonight. Thank you to everybody who donated to help support this series through Eventbrite. And if you want to make a donation to support the Schomburg Center's education department, please do so at schomburgcenter.org/support education. Thank you all once again. Stay safe, everyone. Good night. See you on December 3rd.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Can we get a copy of the chat? Is that going to be preserved with all the questions?
Let's try.